Today's case is one of those stories that reminds you that the truth really is stranger than fiction sometimes. Seriously, if you were to put the twist from this case in a Hollywood movie, half the audience would be rolling their eyes by the end and saying, "Come on, there's no way that would work." It's not so much the crime itself that's hard to believe, it's how the person responsible was able to get away with it for so long. The perpetrator not only had everyone fooled, including the police, his act was so convincing that for years, no one believed that this crime had actually even happened. In the fall of 1992, life couldn't have been going better for 32-year-old Lisa Dillman. She had 2 children she absolutely adored, a beautiful home, and she lived in a community where a lot of people loved and respected her. She was also newly married to the man of her dreams, a 31-year-old doctor named John Schneeberger. Lisa and John's love story had been an unusual one. They'd only met a few years earlier while the pair of them were working together at a small medical clinic in the tiny town of Oxbow, Saskatchewan. Now, for those of you that don't have the greatest sense of Canadian geography, Saskatchewan is smack dab in the middle of the Canadian prairies. It's a province that's synonymous with agriculture and is loaded with all these quaint and picturesque little farming communities. And I do mean little. There are only like 1.2 million people in the entire province, so a lot of these towns have well under 2,000 people in them. Anyway, John and Lisa met in 1987, shortly after John immigrated to Canada. John was originally from Africa. He had been born in what is now Zambia in the early 1960s, but had spent most of his life in South Africa. John came from a pretty well-off family. His father was a doctor and his mother was a school teacher, and they'd had the money to send him to boarding school. From an early age, it became clear that John was gifted academically, and eventually he decided to follow in his father's footsteps and become a doctor as well. If you know anything about the history of South Africa and apartheid, you'll know that things were particularly unstable in the country during this period. So a lot of people with the means to do so were leaving, and John had been one of them. The reason he had ended up in Saskatchewan, of all places, is because at the time the Canadian government was in the middle of a pretty big recruiting campaign for doctors, specifically ones that were willing to work in rural communities. When John arrived in Canada, he knew nobody, but he quickly made a good impression on those around him. In addition to being quite a talented doctor, he was young, charismatic, and outgoing. All of these things really drew Lisa in, and they struck up a friendship, one that quickly turned into something more. Now, I said before that John and Lisa's relationship was not the most conventional one. That's because when they met, Lisa was already married with 2 children. It's not exactly clear what Lisa's relationship was like with her husband, but what we do know is that John really swept her off her feet. From the sounds of it, he was big into the romantic gestures, and within a year, Lisa had gotten a divorce and she and John were engaged. They decided to start their new life together about 60 miles away in another small town called Kipling. Over the next few years, things went incredibly well for the new couple. John and Lisa purchased a spacious new home. Lisa brought her 2 kids with her who got along with John really well, and in 1991, they went ahead and got married. At the same time, John joined a medical practice with 2 other doctors out of the local Kipling Memorial Union Hospital and established himself as one of the most popular and trusted medical professionals around. People absolutely loved him there, and they were ecstatic to have someone that they considered to be a world-class doctor in their small town. John wasn't just adored professionally, though. He also got very involved in the community. He volunteered his time to help the less fortunate, and he was at the forefront of a campaign to raise funds for a town swimming pool. For Lisa, all of this was like a dream come true. She felt so blessed to have met John and for this amazing life that he had chosen to build with her. People around town were not shy about telling her how lucky she was either. Not a day would go by when someone wouldn't come up to her and say, you hit the jackpot. It was a great feeling. Lisa was a huge fish in this small pond, and it was all because everyone loved her husband. But just when it seemed like things were at their best, something would happen that would threaten Lisa and her family's fairy tale life. It began late one evening when a woman came forward with an incredibly disturbing story. At around 9:30 p.m. on November 1st, 1992, a woman named Candace Fonagy walked into a hospital and said that she needed help right away. It wasn't just medical assistance that she was after, though. Candace said that she also wanted to speak to the police. Candace was 23 years old, and she was from Kipling, but this hospital was not the one local to her. Instead, Candace had traveled nearly 100 miles to Regina, the province's capital city. According to her, there was a good reason for this. You see, this was actually her second visit to a hospital in less than 24 hours. And that first visit, that's what she was there to speak to them about. Candace said that she had been sexually assaulted by her doctor, John Schneeberger. When police arrived and spoke to Candace alongside medical personnel, she told them that it had all started the previous day, October 31st. That evening, she had been in the middle of a shift at the gas station where she worked in Kipling when her ex-boyfriend had unexpectedly come in. The breakup between them was fairly recent, and Candace said that she was still feeling pretty raw about the whole thing. An argument began between them, one that only got worse when Candace learned that her ex was moving on with someone else. In a rage, she ended up kicking her ex's pickup truck as he drove off. She hit it so hard that she ended up hurting her foot. Because of this, and the fact that she was just really upset, she called another employee to cover for her, then drove to the Kipling hospital where her friend was a nurse. When she got there, Candace said that she found out her friend wasn't working, and by this time, she was having a bit of a meltdown. Another nurse who saw her and was concerned about her emotional state asked if she wanted to see the doctor that was on call, Dr. Schneeberger. Candace said yes, she was already there after all, and she was familiar with Dr. Schneeberger. He was in charge of her lengthy recovery after a recent car crash, and he had also delivered her baby daughter a few months earlier. Candace said that she assumed that Dr. Schneeberger was just going to give her a couple of pills or something to calm her down. But to her surprise, when he entered the exam room, he was holding a needle. He didn't really say much, but she trusted that he knew what he was doing. That's when she said, things got really weird. The drugs were way more powerful than Candace expected. She said almost immediately after she was injected, she became drowsy and delirious. It was like she had been sapped of all her strength, and her muscles had turned into some kind of jelly. She would have fallen over completely if Dr. Schneeberger hadn't guided her to the exam table where he laid her down. Despite being heavily sedated, Candace said that she was still aware of what was going on. That's why it was all the more terrifying when, moments later, she felt her jeans being pulled down and her underwear being pushed to the side. After that, she could tell that she was being sexually assaulted, but she was powerless to defend herself. She couldn't fight, she couldn't move, she couldn't even scream. That was the last thing that she remembered before waking up and finding her clothes wet with what she believed to be semen. At the same time, she said she saw Dr. Schneeberger walking out of the room. Now, understandably, this was an absolutely gut-wrenching story, but right away, investigators with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police had some tough questions for Candace. They asked her, if she was under the influence of a powerful drug, was she sure that all of this had happened the way that she thought? Moreover, was she positive it was John Schneeberger who had assaulted her? Finally, why had she waited nearly 24 hours before seeking any help or telling authorities about this? As far as the assault went, Candace said that she had no doubt whatsoever that John was the one responsible. He was the only person in the room with her at the time that she was drugged, and she said that he had made some very strange comments to her afterwards. When she asked him what she had been injected with, she said he replied, quote, "Why? Did you have some wild dreams?" In terms of why she'd waited to come forward, Candace said that even after waking up, she was in no state to go anywhere. The drugs were so strong that she had been kept in the hospital overnight, and she explained that she was terrified of telling anyone that worked there what had happened because she knew they all loved John so much. Candace said that police didn't have to take her word for any of this, though. She wanted a rape kit done. She had also brought the jeans and the underwear she had been wearing at the time of the assault. Sure enough, when swabs were taken, semen was found on Candace's clothing and in her body. That wasn't all, though. During the medical exam, doctors noticed a mark on her right arm where she said that she had been injected. A urine test revealed even more. A drug called midazolam was found in her system. This last bit was a pretty big deal. Midazolam, which is commonly sold under the brand name Versed, is a type of benzodiazepine medication, and it's powerful stuff. To give you an idea, it's most commonly used as a pre-medication given to patients before they are put under for surgery. So, not the kind of thing doctors are supposed to be giving out willy-nilly, especially because Versed can slow or even stop your breathing if it's not carefully administered under proper monitoring and supervision. There's one additional common side effect of Versed that I want to mention here, and that's memory loss. The reason I bring that up is because it's something that would quickly become important for the RCMP, particularly when they went to speak with John Schneeberger, and he offered a very different story than the one that they had been told by Candace. During a conversation a few days later, John confirmed that he had treated Candace on October 31st and that he had given her Versed, but he completely denied assaulting her, saying that nothing even remotely unprofessional had happened between them. As for why he'd injected Candace with such a powerful drug, he said it was for her own safety as well as the safety of others. He claimed that she'd severely underplayed how angry and out of control she was behaving that night, and that he'd specifically heard her make threats about killing her ex-boyfriend. He decided that this was the only way to calm her down. In terms of the accusation of sexual assault, John said he was completely shocked and didn't have any idea where this was coming from. He said the only thing he could think of was that maybe Candace had been assaulted by another patient. He stated that the hospital occasionally had problems with elderly wanderers who would leave their rooms and sneak into other people's beds. But he also reiterated that Versed is a drug that's known to make people forget things. Perhaps Candace had simply gotten stuff jumbled in her head due to her agitated emotional state. Authorities weren't sure about John's explanation, particularly because that semen evidence Candace had given them had to have come from somewhere. Still, John was being cooperative and insisted that he was eager to clear his name. As a show of good faith, he agreed to voluntarily submit a DNA sample. On November 16th, John provided 2 vials of blood to investigators. The blood was drawn at the hospital, but was done so under the supervision of an RCMP officer and a lab technician. The blood was sent off for DNA analysis against the swabs taken from Candace's body and clothing. It would take months for the tests to come back, but when they finally did, the results were clear. John Schneeberger's blood was not a match. When the DNA analysis came back, it was late spring of 1993. By that time, the story of Candace's accusation against John had been the talk of the town for months. And let's just say that many people were not surprised by the results. I already talked a lot about how much people in Kipling loved John Schneeberger. Well, as it happened, Candace had a reputation of her own, and it wasn't a good one. Candace was known as someone who was impulsive and irresponsible, a party girl who didn't have a lot of money or prospects, and who often had problems controlling her anger. Case in point, remember that community swimming pool effort I told you about that John had been involved with? Well, at a fundraising event for it, Candace had made a pretty big scene. She got into an argument with her then boyfriend, one which got progressively louder until Candace began punching him. The whole thing happened in front of a ton of people. So, yeah, not exactly a good look. On top of this, there were those that didn't like Candace because she was an unmarried single mother. Her daughter's father wasn't in her life, and there were quite a few people who, quite frankly, judged and looked down on her for that. So when this wild scandal broke, for many, the decision as to who to believe was clear. I mean, who were they going to trust? The broke single mother who was known as the town hothead? Or the respected doctor and family man with a squeaky clean record and an impeccable reputation? And keep in mind, this is how a lot of people felt before the DNA results came in. Afterwards, basically everyone was on John Schneeberger's side. That's why locals were even more shocked when they heard what happened next. Candace was refusing to accept the results of the tests. She still insisted that John had sexually assaulted her, and now she was accusing police of helping to cover up the crime. Specifically, she pointed out that the RCMP officer who had been present when John's blood was taken was also his patient. She argued that the officer could have colluded with John to try and switch the samples at the lab, and demanded that new tests be conducted. The RCMP denied doing anything like this, and pointed out that there had been multiple people supervising the whole process. But Candace was relentless, and she continued to petition for a new round of DNA samples and analysis. After months of this, police finally gave in. They knew they didn't have enough evidence to force John to submit to another test, but just like last time, he agreed to provide another blood sample voluntarily. He said that he just wanted to put this whole thing behind him, not just for his own sake, but for the well-being of his family. When the blood was drawn, the RCMP didn't want to take any chances. They got 2 more vials of blood from John's left arm, and were careful to make sure that the samples were meticulously handled, packaged, and labeled so that there could be no question that everything was above board. After everything was sent off, it took another few months for the analysis against the semen evidence to be conducted. When the results did come back, though, once again, they were clear as day. The blood was not a match. The results pretty much solidified everyone's opinions about the case. And if you thought people were angry about the first DNA test, oh boy, the second one sparked a full-blown public outcry in Kipling. Now, people didn't just think Candace was wrong or mistaken about what had happened. They believed that she was actively trying to destroy John Schneeberger and his family, and she was wasting precious police and government resources to do it. In terms of why, the rumor mill was churning with explanations. Some thought that Candace was obsessed with John and was trying to break up his marriage. After all, they argued, many women in town thought he was attractive and would have jumped at the chance to be with him. The other major theory was that Candace was a gold digger who was hoping for some sort of big payout to take care of her ongoing financial issues. Whatever the case, in the minds of locals, this was now a settled issue. John Schneeberger had cleared his name twice and had been vindicated with hard science. To the astonishment and outrage of many, however, Candace still wouldn't back down. She said she knew what John had done to her and that he was guilty. She said that she didn't know how this was happening, but something was wrong here. As you might imagine, though, nobody wanted to hear this. By now, it was 1994, and this had been going on for well over a year. Even the RCMP started to back away from Candace at this point. With essentially nothing to go on, they closed their investigation towards the end of that year. Around the same time, Candace left Kipling and moved to Regina. While her parents and a close circle of friends still supported her, she felt that she was no longer welcome in the town where she'd been born. On the flip side, this was a huge victory for John Schneeberger and his family. It was also a huge relief for his wife, Lisa. She had always stuck by John and steadfastly maintained his innocence, but it was stressful nonetheless because their family was about to grow. Throughout all of this, Lisa had struggled to understand why Candace was behaving this way. Clearly, everyone could see what an amazing person her husband was, so why was she doing this to them? Still, as time went by, Lisa found it easier to focus on being grateful for what she had, especially as things returned to normal. Over the next couple of years, she and John would go on to have 2 daughters together, and John's career would advance even further when he was promoted to the Kipling Hospital's chief of medicine. It looked like the dust had settled, but what Lisa and basically everyone else didn't know is that this whole situation was far from over. You see, while Candace Fonagy may have left town, she had not given up her fight. And she was about to uncover something that would call everything that had happened up until now into question. In the fall of 1996, so nearly 4 years after Candace first came forward with her sexual assault allegations, the RCMP was contacted by a lawyer. That lawyer was representing Candace in a civil suit that she was filing against John Schneeberger. He explained that he had evidence that he needed to share with them, which he felt could and should lead to a second criminal investigation. So it turned out that after leaving Kipling, Candace and her family had scraped together whatever money they could. Over the next couple of years, they had spent more than $140,000 on lawyers, private detectives, and DNA testing of their own. All of it had led to what they now claimed was proof that Candace had been telling the truth all along. Specifically, Candace and her parents had hired a private investigator named Larry O'Brien, who managed to obtain a chapstick from John Schneeberger's car. When that chapstick was tested against the semen evidence, they got a totally different result than those previous tests police had conducted. Unlike the blood samples, saliva from the chapstick was a DNA match. The RCMP had no idea what to make of this. Of course, the first thing they did was take a good look at the tests Candace and her lawyer had done, but after careful review, they were found to be legitimate. Unfortunately, as compelling as this new information was, though, police were still pretty limited in what they could do. Remember, those first 2 DNA tests had been done under proper supervision, and there was still no proof that they had been tampered with. I mean, RCMP officers themselves had seen the blood being drawn from John Schneeberger's arm. There was another problem, too. You see, the way Larry O'Brien had obtained the chapstick that had been used for that private testing wasn't exactly legal. Actually, scratch that. It was totally illegal. O'Brien straight up broke into John's car to acquire it. So that meant that there was no way this evidence was going to hold up in court. The only thing the RCMP could think of to do was to go back to John Schneeberger and ask him to provide a DNA sample for a 3rd time. To everyone's surprise, he agreed. For the 3rd test, the RCMP pulled out all the stops. They did the testing at a special lab in Regina and brought in a serology expert to help with the blood draw. Just FYI, serology is the study of blood and other bodily fluids. Police also decided to film the whole procedure to make sure they had a record of everything and that absolutely no mistakes were made. The footage you're seeing on screen right now is part of that video. Now, the 3rd test started out just like the others. A needle and collection tube were inserted into John's left arm right around the elbow area. But this time, pretty quickly, something strange happened. Despite using what looked like a prominent vein in John's arm, very little blood came out. What did also didn't look 100% right, to the point that the serologist actually commented about this during the recording.
It's a little strange in that, like the blood doesn't look really kind of fresh. I don't know.
Eventually, they were able to get 2 smaller samples, which were taken away for testing. But things only got weirder once these samples were analyzed. It turned out that the blood contained no DNA. It was like it had degraded. But this didn't make any sense. Everyone had just seen it come out of John's arm. At this point, police were back on Candace's side. They were convinced that something was going on here, but they were at a loss to explain what that was. They also knew that it would be ridiculous to ask for a 4th DNA sample. They were completely stuck. Just when things seemed like they were at their most hopeless, though, investigators got a new lead. It would finally begin to explain this whole situation, but it would also come from an absolutely heartbreaking place. One day in the spring of 1997, so a few months after the 3rd DNA test took place, Lisa Dillman's eldest daughter, who we're going to refer to as Stephanie for reasons that will become obvious in a second, told her that they needed to talk. She said, "Mom, I have something to show you." She then took Lisa into her bedroom, where she pulled back the covers on her bed. Trapped in the sheets was the wrapper from a condom. Now, Stephanie was only 15 years old, so Lisa was alarmed just by the mere presence of this wrapper. But what she heard next would completely shatter her world. Stephanie explained that the previous night, John, so her stepfather, had told her that he would help to remove a plantar's wart from her foot. He told her to lie down on the bed and that it was going to be quick, but that he needed to freeze the area around the wart first so that she didn't feel any pain. He injected her with something, but it wasn't any kind of local anesthetic. Stephanie said that she almost immediately went numb and passed out after receiving the injection. When she woke up, she had found the condom wrapper in her sheets. She believed that John had sexually assaulted her. As horrifying as this already was, it got much, much worse. Stephanie said that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. She said weird things like this with John had been going on for at least 2 years. since she was just 13. After hearing this, Lisa was devastated. She asked her daughter, why didn't you come to me sooner? Stephanie told her that she wasn't sure how her mom would react. She knew how much she loved John. And she had seen what happened to Candace. But Lisa did believe Stephanie, and as soon as John got home that day from work, she confronted him. He instantly went full scorched earth on Stephanie, saying that she was a liar who had never liked him and was just holding a grudge. His reaction told Lisa everything she needed to know. She knew her daughter was telling the truth, and she now knew that Candace had been all this time as well. She kicked John out of the house and called the police. During a subsequent interview, Stephanie repeated all of the same stuff to detectives that she had told her mother. She explained how John had been drugging her and assaulting her for years, with the details of the crime mapping almost identically onto what Candace had claimed all the way back in 1992. Stephanie's accusations were very credible on their own, but investigators soon had even more to work with. While looking through some things at their home, Lisa came across a box belonging to John, one that contained needles, syringes, condoms, and most telling of all, Versed. More of the drug would later be found inside of Lisa and John's lakeside cabin. John had stashed away large amounts of it hidden in the crawl space. And remember, this was not some casual drug that doctors were supposed to be taking from the hospital. Versed is dangerous, and it's incredibly reckless to administer it to someone without them being hooked up to the proper monitoring equipment. With all of this now in hand, police would conduct one final DNA test, but this one would be notably different from all of the others. So, you may have been wondering before, if the blood tests kept coming back with these weird results, why hadn't police tried to test John Schneeberger's DNA in a different way? For example, saliva or hair. The answer is that they did try, but John was very insistent about only providing blood samples, specifically ones from his left arm. This was strange because police did not need a whole vial of blood to do a DNA comparison like this. A little bit from his finger would have sufficed, but John said he had a medical condition that caused his fingers to bruise easily. And he was the doctor, right? So who was going to disagree with him about that? Also remember that all three of the blood tests that had been done were voluntary. So police didn't really have a choice but to go along with what John wanted. In fact, this was not the only way in which he had been given a lot of deference because of the circumstances. During the first two blood tests, he had actually ended up taking the needle and collection tube from the lab tech and put them in his arm himself. No one was suspicious of this at the time because, again, John was a doctor, but also because police were right there watching. They saw him put the needle in his arm. For the fourth test, though, John wouldn't get to call the shots. This time, police had a warrant, and they collected everything they could think of, including saliva, hair samples, and blood from John's finger. All of it was a DNA match to the semen evidence from 1992. Just as interesting as what the samples did match, though, was what they did not. None of them were a DNA match to those 3 blood samples that John had voluntarily provided. Somehow, he had switched them out. Again, just like Candace had always believed. Authorities now had enough to arrest and charge John Schneeberger with crimes against both Candace and Stephanie, but police were still wondering, as I'm sure you are, how was John able to trick all of those DNA tests? How was he able to swap out the blood? Well, the answer to that would finally come out. But the only thing more shocking than the method was how John Schneeberger chose to reveal it. So, during John's trial in late 1999, his defense team threw whatever they could think of at the wall to see what stuck. They tried discrediting and blaming the victims, saying that their stories weren't credible and that they were merely accusing John because they were jealous or wanted some kind of personal gain. But this was a judge-only trial, so there was no jury to emotionally sway. As a result, the defense tried a different tactic, putting John on the stand. Now, most of what John said during his testimony was just nonsense. He told this elaborate story about how Candace had somehow secretly come to his house and dug through his trash until she found a condom. He then theorized she had emptied the contents inside herself and onto her clothing before alerting police so that she could frame him. This was completely crazy and a total lie, but what followed was very interesting. You see, John confessed that he had provided false blood samples during all of the tests he had voluntarily submitted to. John explained that around the same time he was first approached about giving his DNA, he came up with a plan. During some routine tests with one of his male patients, he took a whole bunch more blood than what was needed. He put the extra blood in a fridge at work and added anticoagulants to prevent it from clotting or thickening. Once John had the blood, he grabbed a type of surgical tube called a Penrose drain. This is essentially a long, flexible tube made of rubber that is normally used to drain fluid from wounds during surgery. Instead of using it as intended, though, John used it as an artificial vein. He filled the tube with some of his patient's blood and pinched off the ends before slicing open his own left arm and slotting the tube down towards his elbow. If you're thinking there's no way this could have been convincing, well, you can actually see what this looked like in the video of the third blood withdrawal. If you look closely, there's a moment where John rolls up his sleeve a little bit too high and the fake vein is clearly visible. This is why John made sure to wear a long-sleeve shirt during all 3 of the blood withdrawals, so that police and lab techs couldn't see his upper arm, particularly the area where he had cut near his biceps. If that's not insane enough, remember, John did this multiple times. He never thought he'd be doing more than one test, so he removed the tube after giving the first sample. When he was asked for the second and third, he had to cut open his arm again and repeat this whole charade. But he messed up the last time. Because so much time had passed, the blood he had taken from his patient was old, and he didn't have very much of it left. That's why it looked weird when it was drawn and why the DNA had degraded. Prosecutors were stunned when John admitted to all of this on the stand. It explained everything and also showed a level of forethought and deception that was absolutely chilling. John tried to save himself by claiming all of this was something he had done proactively to try and protect himself from false allegations, but it was too late. His story made no sense, and he had given too much of the truth about what he had done away. The other evidence against him was also overwhelming. The vials and vials of Versed inside of his home, and the DNA matches from the 4th and final test. In November of 1999, John Schneeberger was convicted of sexual assaults on both Candace and his stepdaughter. He was also found guilty of administering a stupefying or overpowering drug to facilitate an assault, and administering a noxious substance to endanger human life. Despite the incredibly disturbing and disgusting nature of his crimes, John was sentenced to just 6 years in prison. He would only end up serving 2/3 of that sentence, though, before being released in 2003. Obviously, this was a slap in the face not just to John's victims, but to all of the other people he had betrayed. Candace would later point out in an interview that she had spent nearly 2 times longer fighting for justice than John actually ended up serving behind bars. This wasn't the only miscarriage of justice in this case, in my opinion, though. You see, John continued to harass and make the lives of his family members miserable even while he was in prison. By insisting that his parental rights be respected, John was able to legally force Lisa, who by now had divorced him, to bring his 2 young daughters to visit him while he was locked up. Yes, that's right. The government compelled Lisa to bring 2 underage girls to visit a convicted predator in prison. Though Lisa did her best to fight this, and only 1 visit would ever happen that was quickly shut down by a social worker, the fact that it happened at all is insane. Especially because Lisa was also fined during this time for not complying with the visitation orders, which, she disobeyed to protect her children. As a Canadian citizen, I have to say I am ashamed and disgusted that our justice system allowed something like this to happen. Speaking of that, if there was any small silver lining to this, it's that shortly after his release from prison, John Schneeberger was stripped of his Canadian citizenship. You see, during the application process, he had lied about being the subject of an ongoing investigation. As a result, his citizenship was revoked and he was deported to South Africa. He was also stripped of his medical license. I should say that this is the smallest of small silver linings, though, because shortly after arriving back in South Africa, it sounds like John pretty much got to resume his life as normal. Some reports suggest that he was even able to get his medical license back there, though that's not 100% clear. In any case, though, I would argue he shouldn't have been a free man in the first place. According to the most up-to-date sources we were able to find, John was most recently living with his mother in the city of Durban. I don't know about you, but for me, this story was absolutely heartbreaking start to finish. It's one I've known about for a long time, and it's honestly one we haven't covered on the channel up until now because, quite frankly, it infuriates me every time I think about it. Not only was John Schneeberger arguably able to get away with what he did, the victims were the ones that were treated like criminals, particularly Candace. And if it weren't for her perseverance and resilience, this case probably never even would have been solved. I think I've made my thoughts on this one pretty clear already, so I don't have too much more to say. But I will leave you with this. If anything, this story is a good reminder that we're all capable of wildly misjudging people's character, especially when we reduce them to nothing more than caricatures, like the single mother who's made bad choices, or the squeaky clean family man who's been elevated to the status of town hero. None of us are infallible. And in my opinion, we should inherently distrust any instincts that make us generalize people and cause us to believe that we know more about them than we really do. Just something to think about.
Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you'd consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.